Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm the founder and director of Depth Psychology Alliance. And you are joining us for our new pilot program, which is aimed at finding new and different ways for members of the depth psychology community to connect with each other, besides just the online written website. And as you probably know by now, Dinner and Depth offers a depth discussion between myself and another person, in this case, Judith Harte, who is an astrologer and licensed psychotherapist. And then after our discussion, the phone lines will stay open until the end of the hour so that those of you who would like to discuss what you heard or ask questions to each other or even comment or connect around other depth psychology topics that interest you, you can definitely do that. And this conversation actually will be largely unmoderated, so we do ask that you be sure and just be courteous and use compassion in your dealings with your fellow community members. So how that works is that everybody starts off muted to avoid echo and hopefully background noise as well. And to unmute yourself, if you'd like to say something or ask a question, then you can press *7 on your phone or on your computer if you're dialing via the web call function. And then to mute yourself back again, you just hit *6. So again, just be aware of any background noise, and we also suggest that if you can use earphones, if you're planning to talk, that would be really helpful because that helps to eliminate any chances of echo that's coming out from a speakerphone or from a computer. So that's it. Let's give it a go, and please do allow the full discussion to finish, and then you can go ahead and use the *7 to unmute yourself and have that conversation if you'd like. And you can also use the live text chat at the same time, and in fact you can use that anytime during the hour, so please feel free to start using that right away. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to my guest for this week for Dinner in Depth, and that is Judith Harte, who is both an astrologer and a therapist. So Judy, I'm really happy to have you with me today. Thanks for joining me.
Well, gosh, I'm thrilled to be here, and happy too.
Great. Well, I'm excited to talk to you about a number of things, both the unique combination of calling that you have, really, which is to be both an astrologer and a therapist. So I think that's something that is going to be really juicy for us to dig into. And then I also want to talk to you about the book that you have recently co-authored with Hadley Fitzgerald, which is called Images of Soul, Reimagining Astrology. And so we'll get into that. And then for our listeners, I'll share a little bit about you, Judy, and then I'm sure more of your story will come out as we go into it. But Judy has been an astrologer since 1975, so that's a long time. She's got a long history and a lot of expertise in the field. But she's also a therapist, and she has an MA in clinical psychology and also a Ph.D. in counseling psychology. And you can find Judy's website at imagesofsoul.com, and of course that's also the name of the book that she's written with Hadley Fitzgerald. And Judy writes on her website, I'm just going to read this, Judy, because I just found it so poetic and really beautiful. She writes, "The most tragic of our life struggles may seem less tragic and more meaningful when viewed through the layered lens of the arts, the time-honored tales of myth and dreams, the poignant and or uplifting tones of music, and yes, the exciting theater of one's astrological horoscope. I have a great love for the astrological language," she writes, "which is the language of myth and story." So, Judy, this is really a beautiful way to, I think, launch us into our conversation. This idea of the language of myth and story, I would never necessarily put those together with the field of astrology, because in my own upbringing and background, they were always sort of different fields to me. I wonder if you can start us off by just talking a little bit about what the connection is between myth, story, and astrology. When you use the tagline on your book, Reimagining Astrology, does that have something to do with it?
Absolutely. I think that it's again the obvious. The obvious is if you know about the horoscope and even if you just know about terms like Venus and Mars, which are points and planets in the chart, they're also Greek gods. And every important planet in the chart is named after a god or goddess. And god or goddesses, gods and goddesses, have stories or myths associated to their becoming and their somehow living in this mythical place, these stories really become our stories. Venus is really my Venus. Her struggles with love, or your Venus, or her gaining of love and beauty and all the things that she's noted for become our stories in a living way. So that's, I don't know if that explains it. I mean, there's an explanation that could go on for centuries, obviously. But I'm trying to just say that the names of the planets are the gods and goddesses, and as such, the stories that they carry and that we know them for become our stories, and we live them out in an embodied life.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And, of course, when you say that you could go on for centuries about this, of course, the myths and those stories that you're talking about have gone on for centuries, if not millennia. And so these are, in some ways, living stories that are surrounding us and that we are involved in and participating in at every moment in our lives. And, of course, the relationship, the way I see it, between the gods and goddesses also are relationships between us and them, I suppose.
Well, we are in their lives as much as they're in ours. I mean, that's the point. I really think it might sound very abstract and hard to get your arms around, especially if it's Venus. You want to put your arms around her. But you know what I mean? I mean, this is deep, complex, and very exciting stuff. And I find that when it's brought into the astrological world, it enlivens that world and raises it up pretty high to a level that is very exciting and takes it out of the newspaper predictive columns. You know, it's quite lovely.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, I was actually, what you were saying sparked something for me, because in Jungian psychology, depth psychology, we often correlate in some ways the gods with archetypes, with what Jung conceived of as archetypes, and that is kind of patterns of being that are recognized usually across time and across eras. Now, I will say that's debatable. Some people have debated whether or not the gods are archetypes or if they're representation of archetypes, and that's not really for our conversation here. But I do know that you practice what is often called archetypal astrology. So I wonder if you can just expand on that just a little bit for us to understand better what archetypal astrology is as compared to maybe what people just know of as traditional astrology.
Well, I actually think that the question that you just asked was very important. In a way, I answered it before you asked the question, I think. Because what really one could say is that the behavior of the planets in the astrological horoscope is archetypal. So that when you're talking about a behavior, I'm trying to avoid using the language because it's extremely complex if you don't know it. If an astrologer or an astrological psychotherapist looks at the chart and sees patterns connected to some of the figures in the chart, you could speak of that behavior as archetypal in that it's reminiscent of what the god or goddess in that case might be guilty or known for. Guilty of or known for. So that it's a behavioral thing.
Judy, can you just give an example of what that might mean when you say a god that and his behavior or her behavior?
Gosh, you know, we're getting into such deep stuff about archetypes and the behavior and what they are, and I think they were termed first forms somewhere along the line, and I'm certainly far from an authority on the subject. However, when we're very specific and it's contained within the chart, sometimes behavior that's associated with planetary gods or goddesses such as Mars, Venus, Hermes, Mercury, that behavior is similar to this is so complicated because if I had a whole chart here, I could describe it better, but I don't. It's the interpersonal behavior between the planetary figures in the chart that then transfers perhaps to the individual's real life behavior. And it's a resonance between how the person conducts their real life and the way the pattern in the chart is resonant with that. Often it is similar to the kinds of behavior that one associates with those gods and goddesses. That is archetypal. That is, it's descriptive. It's root-based. It's the root function. First form, isn't that what archetype means? A first form of something.
Yeah.
So that the first forms carry out into life and become our forms, our way of expressing the archetype. I'd like to think of an example, but I'm having a hard time.
Well, I mean, that's okay, because I think what occurs to me when you say this is really what happens then when you begin to understand this way of looking at it is that you begin to get some context for what's going on in a person's life. If you can begin to understand which of the planets and or / gods is involved and what their patterns and leanings and gifts and all of those things that make up a concept or a being are, then we can begin to understand, like you said, what's resonating in a person's life in any given moment in time. And you start to begin to be able to read the pattern or read the story that they're in the midst of in that moment or in the course of a lifetime.
Perfect.
All right, you are past step one.
Why couldn't I say that?
Level one. Well, I think you did. So, I mean, this is the beauty of this. You know, I really love astrology, and I've studied it to some extent, but it's never been something that has come easily for me. And I don't know that it necessarily comes easily for anybody. I'm not suggesting that. You've been doing this for a long, long time, and I'm certain that you've put, hours and thousands of hours into it. But why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I'm curious about how you came to study astrology and which came first, the chicken or the egg, meaning which came first. Were you a therapist first who then became interested in astrology, or were you interested in the astrology first?
No, I was interested in the astrology, and I had studied it, and I was, working with people and doing and interpreting their horoscopes, as was my colleague and co-author, Hadley. And Hadley decided to go back to school and get her master's in clinical psychology, and that was something I always wanted to do. And at some point on that intersection where our lives crossed, we had a conversation, and she said it in a way that allowed me to think that, hey, I could do that too. And so I decided to go back to school. And I really found it very useful because when you start doing horoscopes for people, they want more of you in an ongoing sense. And I didn't have the training, and I didn't feel ethically bound at all to continue doing that. I thought that was a very bad idea, and it was unethical. So I needed ethical support, psychological support, state licensing, the stamp of Cronus Saturn, the ultimate authority, that archetype of the father that said, now you can do it. Now you have our blessing and you're authentic. So I did the whole thing. I went and I got a master's and a Ph.D. and I felt really okay and legitimate. And then I knew that I would be all right in seeing people more than once, and it was ethical.
That's really interesting to me. And, I'm always curious because, again, I think in our culture, astrology hasn't always had as much credibility as it might and probably as it deserves. Now, of course, in the depth psychological world, people are far more open to it, and Jung had such a powerful interest in it as well. But I think it gets, again, kind of a bad rap. So I'm really curious about the relationship between the astrology and the therapy. You used the term earlier, astrological therapist, which is pretty cool. I really like that term, and I don't know, if that's something that you came up with or where that came from, but I'm curious about the way that you then interact with clients. For example, if somebody comes in to see you for therapy, but they know that you're an astrologer, do they sometimes request that you do their birth chart, and how do you actually integrate those two processes in your own practice?
Yeah, they will occasionally. I don't mention it very much. However, I do mention it now more than I would have perhaps in the past when I cloaked it a little bit because it was really not the cool thing to do, because then you get lots of eyebrows raised and all of this. But now everything's so out in the open, and they often know that about me before they come in, and so they will often ask for the chart, or if they don't bring it up, usually I probably won't bring it up unless it just kind of slides into the conversation. But I usually wait for them, and the way I would use it is depending on the level of need that the person has psychologically and whether or not they are in a particular crisis. I would say at that point, let's leave the chart out for a while until we mobilize, we get things calmed down and cooled off and begin to work on resolution, and the person has a little more balance. So I don't put the chart first. That's the way I answer it. That's the answer. The horoscope does not come first when I'm working with psychological therapy patients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating, and it's exciting for me to hear, though, that is both that it's an option for clients for the most part, and also that you are paying attention to when the time is right and what is appropriate for each individual person, because of course that's one of the complaints that some people have about astrology, is that it's sort of applied on en masse to every person, and everybody who's born on a certain day of the year can't possibly have the exact same horoscope. Mm-hmm. But of course, you and I know it's far more complex than that, just as it is with any client who comes in for therapy. So,
and I want to say too, Bonnie, that the inverse is also true. That if I'm working with a client who has had astrological time with me and perhaps comes back every year for what we call an update or a solar return, or maybe checks in every few months. If that client gets into a crisis and wants to then come for more ongoing therapy, I would evaluate that in the same way. I would say, is it okay for me to do this? Or maybe we don't mix it up with this person. Maybe I have to refer her out or him out. Or, yeah, this is okay. This is a turn in the road for them, and the horoscope could be a quite helpful map on that journey. So we have to look at the level of crisis and how that works or doesn't work with the astrological perspective. And usually it's really okay.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's just really good to hear that you're paying attention to that, and I think it's an important step in any kind of a relationship, a therapeutic relationship in particular. So let's talk about the book a little bit.
Okay.
I'm really interested in the title that you came up with. It's called Images of Soul, Reimagining Astrology. And I mentioned this earlier, but Images of Soul is such a beautiful and poetic phrase, and it's also, by the way, the URL for your website, which I think is such a great address. Where did that come from, Images of Soul, and what does it mean to you? How did that make its way from your website over to the book?
Well, actually, I can tell you that the whole thing links back to my doctoral dissertation, because that was the title of my doctoral dissertation, Images of Soul. And where that came from was I read a lot of James Hillman, and he was the late James Hillman. Everyone, I think, probably knows that's listening to this, but he was a fine, wonderful, archetypal poet, man, everything, and he was my main teacher, and I just adored him and his thinking, and he would use that various pieces of that phrase throughout his whole writing, and I loved it. I caught it. And the reason the dissertation was important is because my goal for the dissertation was to raise the level of astrology somehow. And I chose to do that by developing a schema and tracing the history of astrology from its root origins, where it was extremely event-oriented, and I showed how it became more and more psychological as the years and decades went on. And I split the work up into several sections and called them perspectives. And I got that from Hillman's writing, because he always spoke of perspectives, I think, as a way of seeing, a way of looking at something. And so I called the first perspective the event perspective. And then I showed that astrology moved from the event place more to the humanistic side, where psychotherapy entered during the days when humanistic psychology was just incredible. And I showed how astrology combined there. And then I moved to the Jungian perspective, where all the myths and the gods and goddesses tenant the horoscope, and astrology and Jungian analysis interpenetrate. And then I went on and I made James Hillman and his colleagues' work important in astrology, and I called it the imaginal perspective. In that sense, astrology became reimagined at that point. So I tied it in with a title, and it seemed, and Hadley seemed to like it, and we agreed that it was a way of reimagining astrology. Those images of soul were reimagined in our book in that particular way, and she added in her whole orientation, which she will tell you about, which, interestingly enough, turned out to be, while it was called something else, we weren't that far apart in the end. Mm-hmm. So my dissertation was the core of the book, in a sense, for those reasons.
Yeah, so it sounds like there was a certain amount of synchronicity that was really at play, particularly as you emerged from the dissertation, and this was really working on you, you know. I mean, there's this thing about how you work on a particular topic or a particular piece of writing, but it's actually working you as much as you're working it. And then there's just your whole relationship that you already had that was ongoing with Hadley. And, of course, the first part of the book, and a lot of the book, is based on these letters between the two of you, this correspondence that you both had with each other for years and years. Mm-hmm. And it seems like over the course of that time, and those similarities that you actually began to identify led to something that really grew into this amazing, beautiful tree. So I want to take that image and turn that back to what you were just talking about, which is Hillman's work. Of course, he has this idea that he calls the acorn theory. Mm-hmm. And this seems to be a pretty central influence in your book as well. Can you just talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, it seemed as if the acorn theory and the horoscope had a whole lot in common to us. And that he refers to this figure, this daimon, as somehow being in charge of our calling or destiny. I like to think of him more not so much as being in charge, but so much as knowing about it. In other words, being in on it. So it lessens the dominance factor of a figure who's in charge and we have nothing to say about it. He knows about it. He knows about our trajectory. He knows about our path. And it seemed to us as if the horoscope and the daimon were somehow interchangeable. And the acorn, of course, came from the fact that Hillman used it, that we're all a specific oak tree. We're meant to become a specific oak tree. All is contained in the acorn, and the daimon has this little secret about it. See, the whole time what you're going to become. But you don't really know it until you read the life backwards and see it at the end. So we used, Hillman once said in one of his lectures, and I think we even discussed this in the book, he said, use my soil, grow your own trees. Mm. And from that, we said, this is our tree. We're going to write this book, and it's going to be our tree. And we added something new to it, which I think is what happens. We keep adding and adding to others' trees. But there are trees. What we added was this amazing mechanism that lives inside the acorn. And the story behind that is really, I love the story. I'll make it really fast because Hadley may want to talk about it. Hadley, when she was surfing the net, discovered this image. And it was the image on our book, which was actually a photograph taken by a Portland photographer. It was an acorn inside a circle. But inside the acorn was something else. This photographer had a habit of slicing real acorns and taking old antique watch parts apart and putting them inside and then taking a picture of it. Mm. And that was so gripping to us when we saw it. We said, this is the cover of our book. This is the acorn. This is the whole thing. This is the mechanism inside the horoscope that helps lead us to our calling. And we called him and we said, could we use it? He was lovely about it, young guy, darling guy, very talented. And there it was. So that was the cover of our book, and that was the main thrust, or say central image behind everything that went into that book as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, that's an incredible story, and an incredible image. You're absolutely right. You know, what are the chances that you would come upon that image just as you were looking for it, and that it was so ideal to really articulate exactly what it was that you were both trying to portray.
And it worked.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I'm wondering, can you just give us, speaking of images, can you give us an example maybe of how you use images? That was an example, kind of on a general basis, but maybe in your work then as a therapist and or as an astrologer.
Okay.
How do you use images or interact with them? I mean, do they just appear to you, or do you try to call them in, or how does that work?
I use them as a way of permitting and allowing my patients, if it comes up, or my astrological clients, to go with what happens in the session in the format of a dialogue. So say you and I are working together and you come to me and all of a sudden we're kind of struggling someplace and we get it. Somehow, you know, I notice that you're attached to some place in the dialogue, and I urge you to go further with it. Now, it might seem strange because, you know, people aren't there to do that, but I give the person a support to say, okay, so what happened next? And pretty soon, the person is telling a story about something in their life that is easier for them to access than if we directly went at it. So they're talking in images. They're telling a story. And their very soul is located there in that little vignette that comes out. And it's similar to Jung's active imagination, where many Jungians who may be hearing this would understand that the dialogue is often created by one self and the writing that they do on behalf of the object. They're the subject, perhaps, then there's the object that answers, and they dialogue. Well, I do that with a person in my office around an issue that comes up or an image that comes up. I urge them, I get a sense. Like one patient, this is in the book, she had a very difficult time being close and intimate, and she was a young girl and wanted to marry and all that. And we got into the subject of a veil, V-E-I-L, and it seemed totally off the wall. But I felt from her that if she pursued it and allowed herself to talk about this veil and images, we'd get to the psychological issue that she was defending against, and it was really difficult for her in her life. And it happened. It opened up a lot for her. Now, it's hard to describe it. In the book, there's an example of it, so you can sort of see it. But I don't know for our purposes here if it would really be the right thing for me to sit here and give you the dialogue. But you just imagine, allow the person to imagine a dialogue and to imagine the other. And it doesn't have to be a person. In this case, it was a veil, and the veil began to speak. And that was the image of soul.
Yes, that's so, I mean, the power of images, I think, cannot be denied. But it's lovely to hear about a technique that we can all access on some level to be able to hear what is evident in those images if we only will choose to listen. And often if we have somebody who's a guide, like yourself. So I think this idea of an astrological therapist, you have so many resources that you can pull in to create a dialogue like that. And I love what you said about the soul is being right there. A person's soul is there in that dialogue. I think that's really relevant, and that was the power, again, as you mentioned, of Jung's active imagination and also of this technique that you're talking about. And I think it's one way that astrology, through images, can also speak to us.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it opens the range of what we usually think of as, quote, astrological. That was the point, I think, for me of adding another perspective to the work, is that we not only raised its level, but we opened the range. It became more inclusive.
Right, and of course this is so depth psychological, because for me, at least, depth psychology is all about accessing the unconscious. The more ways that we can find to access what that unconscious holds for us and to be able to manifest that and bring that into our lives so that we can either, come into relationship with it and let it diffuse if it's a complex of sorts, or to be able to tap into whatever that potentiality is in our lives is just so important.
Oh, 100%, as they say today. That's a phrase that everyone uses. Oh, 100%. But you hear it everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I guess.
Come from?
Yeah, where do these things come from? Indeed, that is the question. Well, Judy, we're nearing the end of our time together, but I'd like to just kind of close on one last question, which is really near and dear to my heart, and I think you would have some interesting insight. And it's really about the planetary crisis, because it's pretty hard to escape the fact these days that we have a lot of challenges going on in our planet, and it's everything from racial tensions to religious tensions to just the difference between class and rich and the poor, and then, of course, the whole ecological crisis and climate crisis that we're facing. There's just a lot going on, and of course, we have a lot of technology that you would think would be developed enough now to help us engage with these challenges and hopefully overcome them, but it's clearly not enough. And in fact, sometimes technology is part of the problem, not always. But I'm just wondering what you see the role of astrology and psychotherapy, or astrological psychotherapy, is in our world today and moving into the future. How do you think it can play a role, or what is our relationship going to be with it moving forward?
I don't know. Will it play a role? Gosh, it can't not play a role. If nothing else, it will reveal and resonate to what the changes are as they happen. In a predictive sense, that's a pretty hard, this really calls and challenges predictive astrology when we're going through times like this, because there's the inclination amongst people who look to astrology as a prognosticator of things that you just mentioned and outcomes, which I unfortunately don't, and I'm really glad I don't, and I'll tell you why, because I'm up at night enough worrying about everything. I don't really want too many other things to sit around and look and wonder, well, is it going to happen now or when? I try not to do that, but actually you're onto something whether you know it or not. That yes, there are strong current resonances between the symbolic movement of the planets and what is happening in our outer lives. Yes, there are resonances all over the place. Are there conclusions and predictions and hints and clues about that? If we don't take heed of what we need to do to straighten it out, yeah, that's the case always. If we do what we can to fix these messes that are here everywhere, if we can fix them, perhaps we can transform and transmute the planetary stories that everyone is talking about of doom and gloom, should we not do it? Should we really overlook and continue to, as Hillman said, keep soul from the world? If we start to care about the world enough to do whatever we can, no matter how dire it seems right now, to return soul to the world, we can lift this gloom and doom that is hovering over us all the time, everywhere at every turn. I don't know how it's going to be, but this is our chance. So it's up to us to make the choice as a collective, as a global society, whether or not we can take this seriously enough to try and fix it. If we do, I think it can be, I think we can certainly make enough of an impact so that we can take that good turn in the road.
So beautifully articulated. Judy, thank you so much. I've been speaking with Judith Harte, who's an astrological consultant and also a marriage and family therapist, licensed psychotherapist, and she's been doing both of these for a long time. Judy, your views are just so powerful and provide such great insight, and I so much enjoyed our time together.
Well, I did too, and look what you've done. I mean, I enjoyed it being in your presence. I mean, you've done amazing work, and you're to be commended, and it will only continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's that acorn at work, as we talked about. I really appreciate your comments and also your time and your willingness to share your work with us. You can find Judy's work again at imagesofsoul.com. And, of course, the book is the same name, Images of Soul, Reimagining Astrology. And Judy also has a presence on both Facebook and Twitter, so you can follow her there as well. Judy, thank you again.
You're most welcome. Take care.